any further ado, I have to call upon the Prime Minister. Hear, hear. Woo!
Yeah, give me a second. Can you hear me well? Cool. Cool. 3, 2, 1. We believe that this is in the interest of democratic states to improve the perception of justice and their perception in the religious community. Few clarifications to make this debate clear. Firstly, in terms of should allow, we believe that this is not forcing them. So if you are the member of the religious community, you have ability to choose in under which system you want to be judged. But important note is, we are talking if you violated the law or like the jurisdiction of the state, you can't choose like religious court, you need to be under the state law. Second of all, we believe that will be strict regulations towards the minors, so people under 18, the same as the civil system, will have like a different types of punishment, people above 18. Second of all, what we mean by offenses under religion, we mean both negative and the positive morality, which is to say that, for example, that might be cheating your wife, or that might be also not enough funding for the church in the Mormon religion. We believe that both cases are in the debate. Thirdly, as long as they remain members of that religion, we believe you can't just join and decide, oh, I will get lower punishment, or like, I wanted to check this court. You need to be active member, which spend the time with the community, and only that kinds of people might be allowed to participate there. How this is likely to look like, we believe that in the democracies, you have the interest to keep that transparent and keep people aware and informed. So you probably will push the pressure for this religious community and organization to inform people what will be the punishment, or also what are the rules in that kind of courts, how the procedure will look like. Second of all, we believe that if this court will fucked up, and if that will be some problematic situation, we allow the appeal process to the state and to the government. However, we take the burden that will be a little bit harder, but we believe that these people will have some kind of opportunity to do this. Any clarifications on that point?
Yeah, to be clear, does this also mandate the same forms of punishments that would be endorsed by those religions, e.g. in Sharia or indigenous?
No, so I will move to that in the second point. So you are the member of religious community and the member of the democratic state. So probably you grow up with this religion, you know the law of this religion, and you know a lot of requirements, right? On both sides of the house, you are obliged to follow that by the community, by your parents, or by the people around you. So regardless if we create the state courts or if we don't create this religious courts, you still will be socially punished, or like that kind of behavior will be unacceptable. So we believe that yes, the religious court will be serving justice in the religious term, the terms which are well known for people of this community, in the terms in which you are growing up. If opposition in that case say, oh, people are coerced to the religion and people are forced to do this, or like they were born in particular communities, we have two responses to this. A, on the comparative, they still be living in these communities and they will get the punishment, which will be not official, which will be remaining on the streets, which will be remaining as a disappointment from their parents, which is much less clear than on the comparative. But second of all, the level of coercion in democratic states, it's much lower than in authoritarian religious monarchies, right? Because you have some kind of ability to get information, you are meeting other people, and also usually you have freedom of speech and you have freedom of press, so you get the ability to know the comparative, how the life outside of religion looks like, and you also getting the benefits from both communities. So now about the benefit from both communities, right? You have sharing identity, you have both identity, you are taking benefits from both of the systems, right? As a religion, you're taking benefits from the community, you are taking the funding, you are taking a lot of like personal beliefs, and from the state, you are also taking the benefit that you have where to live, that you can go to work, and you are cooperating under this. The difference is that we have a tendency to cut and separate the law from religion in the democratic state, to look for the majority of the people, to not creating the conflicts and to keep the stability. The issue and conclusion of this is that the law is not religiously friendly, right? It's trying to be much more objective, or it's trying to not engage. Therefore, you have lack of members of religious community in the courts or in the or in the chambers, because they are not fully welcome, but also like states have no incentive to fully offer that to the people. Therefore, the perception of the justice and the law for the people who grow up in the communities, for the people who have sharing that kind of values, it's not very justifiable, right? Because from the very beginning, if you were living under the state, the other institutions and the other people around you didn't represent exactly the same view as you. We believe that in the religious course, you will feel more welcome and you will feel more home. And regardless, even if you get harsher punishment or like under the religious law, this is something which you expect, and this is something which is easier for you to confront, right? Because this is connected to your previous actions. You have this support from your family, of your community, because they know that the punishment or like whatever ruling will happen there, it's exactly reflecting your life or exactly reflecting your book of life, and this is not dependent on some superior powers or like people who never spend time with you, or like people who never share your values, or people who didn't understand why you come to this direction or like why you did particular action. Therefore, this is extremely important, because regardless of how well the justice system will work in any of the democracy, the perception for these people will be always less justifiable than other one. I will take POI from closing now if they have any. Opening.
Yeah, how do you think religious people will react when a judgment given by judges appointed by God is challenged in a secular?
So I don't think that we will be challenged that, right? I mean, I think appealing procedure will be very, very rare and only in extreme situations. And therefore, we believe that if you are doing the appeal from this particular court, you have strong reasons to challenge that kind of people. Therefore, you should have also support from the community, because you will not risk that kind of backlash. So you will need to have a lot of evidence and a lot of reasoning to do this. So we believe that these situations will be very minor and not happen very often. But also, if you have doubts towards the religious system, you will never opt in the system in the first place, right? We don't believe that in many communities you will be like forced and you can't go to the secular system, and you definitely need to go to the religious one. Maybe in the minor situations, but also these people will be punished regardless, because they can't opt out from the society. So the comparative as follows. Even in the worst case scenario, these people still will get the punishment, but the punishment will come from the people around them, from the priests in their village, or from the imams, etc. On our side of the house, you standardize that, and you are making that more transparent comparatively, and give these people the serving of the justice, which they understand and which they will be accepting, which bring the benefits on both sides of the house. I'm not proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister, and we're happy to call upon the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear. Woo! We thank the Leader of Opposition. We're happy to call upon Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear. Woo!
1 second. Yep. Am I audible to all? Cool. Okay, so what I can take away broadly from the opposition speech is that, yeah, religion people have it hard. Sometimes life in a religious community sucks. Religions can be oppressive, religions can be bad, religions can be downright evil. And I fully agree that these are circumstances which exist in the world around us, and we actively think that this proposal will actually make it better for the citizens in those very hard circumstances that the opposition leader was talking about. First of all, some clarifications, because obviously, yeah, he knows it, the speaker knows it. They went immediately to the most extreme cases, so I'm very glad to play on this turf as well. First of all, clearly everybody in this debate agrees there are limits to religious freedom. Yeah, like obviously, if I say I'm starting a religion now, Klaudia is the member. I think stoning is fantastic if she doesn't clean up. Obviously, fun. It sucks for her. If she signs up for my religious court, this is very bad for her. And probably it's better that somebody else sees what I'm doing, sees and allows the outside society to have a little bit of check on me, instead of me being in a close-knit community with Klaudia that I am, and being able to punish her basically however I want, without even the veneer of a appeals process, even without the veneer of social control, even without the veneer of transparency. I think I still moved it forward if I have to actually say to the civilian authorities to put my like verdict into a database and literally say, yeah, I just punished Klaudia for that and that. This is something that actually may lead to changing the religious communities, but I will get to this later. Next, just as we have some explicitly like religiously prescribed practices that we all basically agree are stupid and barbaric, and we ban them without a shred of thinking about this. Yeah, so just like this, I think that the constitutional ban on like cruel and unusual punishment should absolutely be applied to this case, and I don't think that being a religious person should in any way make you more susceptible to stoning, etc. So obviously we have to place some limits for this system to work. Obviously this is going to be a balancing act depending on a society and its democratic choices that the previous speaker was so careful to talk about. And there's a balancing act. We both need to allow some harsh punishments that the outside of this religion people think that are harsh and maybe not that nice, but we also have to allow these societies to kind of be lenient towards some of their members. This is the right of the minority, which has a little bit of a different way of thinking than the main system. So the cruel and unusual punishments are off the hook, just as, for example, the stuff about like punishing children, where we're absolutely strong on the point that we have to put on limits on the religious people's ability to like punish children in a critically strong fashion, just as we do in a civil system. But more than that, like the appeals and overturn bar must be there. It's gonna be higher. You have to since you probably signed a little bit of these appeal rights away by giving yourself to the jurisdiction of the religious community. However, at the end of the day, there needs to be a recourse. And this system allows for that, because at the end of the day, the bar is gonna be higher, but the transparency of the system will allow the judicial system to react to egregious things in this religious community. There's gonna be always a balance. We don't know exactly what that religion, like, for example, will prescribe, but I think that it's very hard to doubt the civilian review. So the state, therefore, treats more lightly in face of the communities that feel threatened, that feel like the judicial system doesn't take their needs into the account, and this isolates those religious communities a lot. Okay, so the extreme cases like of stoning, etc., that the previous speaker tried to paint as the like majority of those, I don't see them as a huge problem. I don't see those democratic countries, those mainly democratic countries, stoning people to death, despite the fact that like the religious minorities are screaming about it all the time, about stoning blasphemers, etc. Those are like extremely like rare cases that anything actually happens. Now, about the socialization point, because this is a very key point. Whether, you know, I'm born into a religion, I'm socialized into it, I'm less likely to opt out. Well, actually, yeah, that's true. Like that's true. But this is why we want to provide an alternative avenue of like airing these grievances inside this community. Exactly, you have no interest in the state. As a person born into a socialized religious community, you see your cleric, you see your priest, these are your authorities. To have a understanding, to have a knowledge that this system of justice that we're prescribing here has a civilian at the end of it who at the very least can be helpful in extreme circumstances, is still progress over what the speaker was talking about. So basically, if I'm in a close-knit community, but the judicial system needs to be a part of a broader civilian system, needs to be like, you know, my verdict needs to go into the database. It needs to be public. It can't be cruel and unusual. Journalists can be, for example, in the court. You have some rights that basically weren't there, were it just for the religious were it just for the religious religious right. So state does not reach there currently, so we increase the reach of state there. And I'm trying to open the chat. CO, there you go.
I'm a little bit confused because I asked a point of clarification and was told that actually the punishments that were dispensed by these communities and they desired would be dispensed, but it also undercuts your mechanism because you aren't allowing these people to do the things they actually want to do. Like Indigenous Australians regularly spear one another through the thigh.
Thanks. The speaker just discovered society. People don't do what they always want. There are limits on what we're doing. I have no idea why this shouldn't apply here. Obviously, there are going to be limits, just like the hook out of every right. Like, I have no idea where the confusion is, so you have some thinking to do. Okay, capacity to change. This is extremely important here, because like finally, like let's get to the final thing, which is like basically, what does it change in the position of in the society of the religious people? It doesn't allow them to do much more, but it brings them to the official system. It brings three key things that I would like to point out. First, society can see how these religions operate. Society has some form of outside view into the religious and judicial practices of those people. Jurisdictions, local communities, journalists can see those verdicts. And this is the mechanism of change, instead of this being me, a cleric, and Klaudia, my like subject in a dark room. Like this is, even if we achieve only this in changing this religious court system, we think we still can take this debate. So basically, I think the opposition had very intriguing case, and I really want to see whether anything blooms out of it. So thank you very much.
We thank Deputy Prime Minister, and to conclude the top half of the debate, we're happy to call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear, woo! We thank the allow and top half of the debate as a whole, and to start the bottom half of the debate, we are happy to call upon the Member of Government. Hear, hear, woo!
Can you hear me? Just give me a couple seconds to get my time. Starting, 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, which type of legal jurisdiction are you more likely to be able to create change in? Secondly, I'll talk about to what extent coercion exists on either side, which is worse. Last, I'll talk about the condition of these communities and their integration in the future. Before that, I want to make a quick clarification. You ought to discount a lot of OO material because a lot of the things they say are very Pakistan-specific examples. In those cases, your religious courts are also your main court. So really, there is a lot of, there is barely any difference between what they say they think is a problem on our side and their actual status quo. So I want you to know that a lot of things like you're always forced into a religious school. You're always forced into sermons, which disproportionately actually makes it, let's say, difficult for you to opt out are not true. All right, 3 questions. Firstly, the ability to change. I want to know 2 things from the opening opposition response in and of themselves to show that all of the things they said that are harmful for religion are not really going to be so bad. Opening government asserts it is unlikely to be this bad. So 2 things. First, you can probably assign individuals with a law degree into these places so they have a reasonable ability and competence to decide what is good and what is the future change of religious practices. That's 1. Second, by their own analysis, they already explained that they ban certain bad practices within religion right now. If that does not lead to people stopping from practicing religion overall, I think it is reasonable to argue that this is plausible on our side. But 2 structural reasons why this will only progressively change. Number 1, to a large extent, religion is losing influence in a lot of these states. We think, therefore, they have an incentive to coexist and modernize. The evidence of this is things like the Pope allowing like LGBTQ individuals into their religion or gay imams across the United Kingdom. We think those are things would have already happened for the sake of their own subsistence. Second, it is often the case that in a lot of these countries where you have these minority religious groups, the 2nd or 3rd generation are now individuals who are coming into positions of power, where you have people like Nouman Ali Khan, who is more integrated into the majority and therefore has reasonably progressively moving ideals with that religious view in comparison to completely extreme positions like they want. So even if it is the case that there is some degree of backwardness in the current views, it is significantly prone to change in the vast majority of places where this debate has any kind of meaningful change. But the comparative they suggest was that states are very easy to change. I want you to note very quickly, they only assert that you can elect lawmakers, therefore you get change. Few responses. Number one, in a lot of instances, when you are a minority religious group, you are not a politically favored group who has the ability to break any kinds of large-scale changes. To a large extent, if it is the case that your interests are competing to other majority religion or majority groups' interests, you are antithetical to the interests of the majority lawmakers. Therefore, you are unlikely to get this change. Second, it is often the case that for this to actually be things which help you in a legal perspective, you need years of precedence and support for this, which means one fine day if a jury is fair, you might get a positive verdict in your favor, but in the vast majority of instances, people still might be against your viewpoint. Therefore, the system is still skewed against you. Lastly, whilst religion itself is based on your community, the broader society is based on the whims of politicians. Therefore, if there is a random rise of a populist agenda based on economic hardship, you have a significant risk of regression of all of those same practices, which means no, the state is not sustainable an actor for these kinds of changes. Rather, religion itself is mostly defensive of your rights and therefore can have a good practice of law. Second, on coercion, I think all they say is that you're often born into religion, therefore you are forced into socializing into that practice. I have a few responses here. Number one, I would say that in the vast majority of instances, you still go to schools which are primarily secular or from majority communities in the vast majority of the world. In instances where all of these people go to only religious schools, they are already active followers of religion. So at that point, this debate no longer has an element of coercion on them either. So their harm of coercion doesn't apply. But it is very likely you're able to opt out based on things like information that opening government already argued. But I would suggest that it is very easy for you to make that judgment call at a point of being punished, because if you are someone who has to any extent been coerced into that religion, you have the option to select self-defense over certain practices of religion. People do not think in your family that their reputation of you being religious only relies on you going to a religious court, which means if you still maintain other elements of your life that are religious, presumably you can still be a part of that family. But opting out of that court system, the point at which it threatens your life or threatens some degree of harm to you, is still fair and does not cost you the degree of exclusion that the opening opposition wants you to believe. In both those instances, then, you are more than able to opt out of religion in a lot of instances. But in the event that you cannot, you don't necessarily have to succumb to the worst forms of punishment at the expense of yourself to essentially go in and maintain your religious community. Both of those then proven, I think opening opposition is largely out of this debate. We have the most powerful mechanism in this debate that beats opening government. But the last thing I want to talk about here is why we think this is fundamentally bad on their side in terms of coercion. Because you are forced to go into a court which is decided by the state you were born into, or a state that you had to go to as a vulnerable individual escaping prosecution. This is things like immigrants moving for economic or political threats in their areas where they're already a vulnerable group moving to a different state, and then they're forced into certain courts for a certain degree of practices. We recognize that states or religions are both things that you might be born into, but the propensity of you changing your religion is significantly higher, or not subjecting to all versions of religion is significantly higher than opting out of state altogether. Second of all, the state's jurisdiction for prosecuting you relies on the extent of legitimacy of they have because you live under them. I would suggest that religion has a significantly higher contribution to a lot of these individuals' lives, where organized religion dictates the majority of your lifestyle, but also this controls not only this current life, but also your next life, where people believe in the afterlife. Therefore, there's a significantly more important weighing factor for the priority in these people's heads. In which case, the vast majority of that is life is dependent on this. You shouldn't force them into one practice. Quickly, COPOI.
So there's a lot of groups in the status quo that don't have their views perfectly represented in secular courts. Why are religions special?
I think the extent to which other groups can be accommodated is more, because to a large extent, those are values which are more likely to be influenced by society than religion in some instances. We would suggest that religion within their scriptures can adjust to this. We would say that in the instance that there are these differences for secular courts which cannot essentially align together or have different belief systems, we would allow them to do the same. I don't really think that in and of itself is something that is a principal difference. But the last thing in terms of how the perception of these entities exist. Currently, it is often the case that people have perceptions of these religious groups based on other factors which create a negative stereotype, where they often think that anytime you do a crime, you are stoned. I would say the opening opposition examples are an extreme one, where in the vast majority of instances, even the ones about your hand being cut off if you steal is the fifth time or third time if you do the same crime, is when these kinds of punishments kick in. I would say there's a false perception created right now because of the absence of visibility on from the ways in which these religious decisions are made. I would just the point at which states are no longer only out excluding these practices and allowing these courts to come into visibility. The likelihood of those states changing is a lot higher. For all of those reasons, vote closing government.
We thank the member of government, and we're happy to call upon the member of opposition. Hear, hear. Woo!
Excuse my very lame headphones. They have LEDs in them. Opening opposition does an excellent job explaining why these people probably can't consent. We are going to prove and engage with the claim made by opening government, which is that the counterfactual is worse because in sort of secluded instances, these sorts of things still happen. I'm also going to do two other things. I'm going to talk about how you modify these religions and why you lead to substantially more backlash against these very disprivileged communities. With that in mind, first link, why is it that this policy makes it harder to reform toxic practices? The first thing to establish here would be that these practices are in fact toxic, but DPM actually backtracks and admits that a lot of the practices we are talking about are in fact toxic. Let's engage quickly with this case shift at PM, because I asked a point of clarification which is answered in the affirmative. These people opted into these terrible punishments and therefore it is legitimate, and DPM backtracks. Two things to note here. First, they contradict the PM's principle at DPM when they say, oh, actually, no, there are some norms of democratic societies that are just tantamount. But secondly, note that it's unclear why anyone would ever avail these systems. If you are a Cheyenne person, why is it that if your traditional forms of remedy weren't available to you, you would opt into these systems at all? So, having established that it is probably true that a lot of these practices are toxic, as is said and conceded by DPM, why then is it that these things become worse? Because opening government makes the claim behind closed doors, these things are fine. 7 reasons. First, you centralize and concentrate resources within offices like religious solicitor offices, right? Which means that there is far more power concentrated in tracking these people down and fully litigating those circumstances. Second, there is now impunity from state recourse. So under the status quo, the state can say, no, that practice is bad. No, you punishing people for sodomy is bad, and you lessen the capacity to do so. Third, there is now state active endorsement, meaning that you are required to do things like teach in schools that it is legitimate to have this, to obviate this separation of church and state. Fourth, you remove the social counter narrative. So now it is much, much easier in social situations for you to defend yourself and your religion by saying the state endorsed it. Fifth, you remove the counter narrative in the media, meaning that the media is now far, far less able to actively critique these practices where they occur. Sixth, there is now a central powerful figures that are established as just judges who have a substantial amount of clout because they subsume these positions within society. And finally, these courts have the facade and trappings of formal Western courts, which lessens their accountability and the scrutability of them, because they are necessarily perceived as being identical and similar to the courts that they are said to embolden. So what is the significance of that? First, it just means that these courts do become more powerful and often do go over the brink of acceptable policy. Second, it sets a bold precedent that the state should kowtow to and facilitate religious norms through those sorts of states. So when opening government tries to do things like model out children, unfortunately, those harms, even to the extent that they want to model them out, still occur. Why is that? First, these sorts of things already occur, and those norms are already in place through things like the circumcision being allowed in the vast majority of Western liberal democracies. But second, the norm very clearly does not care about consent, because when a female refugee from Saudi Arabia lands in the United States, or a Jehovah's Witness in New York City is told that they're going to be exiled if they do opt out of this system, clearly consent is not substantially important. So the third thing to establish then is it not only does it mean that these courts are bad and perpetuate and make it harder to criticize these things that we've proven at DPM concedes are toxic, but it also necessarily means that when these sorts of things happen outside of the courts, when there is FGM, where there is something terrible, you are more likely to believe that it is legitimate. You are less likely to criticize it because more state legitimacy has splashed off that religion in the first instance and into the other activities where it occurs. Second question, how does this modify the behaviors of religions themselves, having established and won the counterfactual and proving that more of these terrible things happen? Notably, very quickly on impacting, opening opposition's material is only activated by our material, right? Because if they say people can't consent, that is only important insofar as in our world, there are more people who are having their consent obviated. Second, with respect to why this modifies the behavior of religions. The first thing to establish is that these two second prongs will establish and engage closely with closing government. This forces these organizations to centralize. This is because they have to create concrete structures of courts. And that means that they are likely to elect people who are aligned with a series of values. First, they are likely to choose people who tend to be the most religious, pious, and conservative figures who can most closely justify them being the voice of God, which means they are more likely to obtain and align with more orthodox teachings of those religions. Second, they entrench long-term patriarchal values because they don't want want to progress and thus alienate their most core aspects of their religions. And thus, they have very strong desires to have those most conservative aspects of their religions representative. What are the harms of that? There are a few. The first is that there are now very formal edicts and proclamations within those often quite sprawling religions, which means that an organization like Catholicism or Anglicanism, which has a series of different and disparate ideas, now has one single structural idea which says this thing is okay and this thing is not okay. And that has two other additional effects. First, stare decisis makes it so that it is harder to get progressive values throughout that church. So it's harder when there is an enshrined thing from 1991 that says sodomy is wrong. It's harder to actually shift the norms and ideas within that state to say that actually maybe that is a bad decision where it is calcified in that respect. But second, you lock people out of being able to align with the aspects of those churches that are more progressive. So if you're a gay person and you find a church that actually does align with your values, when that church is forced to follow the verdict of this central authority, they are forced to kick you out, they're forced to report you, they're forced not to engage with you. Finally, I'm going to talk about backlash. Before I do, I'll take opening government.
Opening opposition said we will ban these practices and protest against them. Which scenario will create worst reaction from religious community towards the states? If you ban them or if you recognize the religious values and trying to give people chance to opt into this?
Okay, so I'm about to give you a series of reasons why the backlash against these communities is actually very, very bad. Hopefully my first argument actually sort of answered this question. But thirdly, it's entirely unclear why it is that the status quo, which is that corporal punishment, for instance, is banned, is necessarily controversial. But in your world, you would seem to suggest that the status quo which we defend has hordes of Indigenous Australians and Islamic people attacking the state for not allowing them to perform stonings and beheadings in Western liberal democracies, which is untrue. So why is there backlash? A series of reasons. First, this is seen as a contravention of the separation of church and state. Notably, this is calcified again within structures like laïcité in France, right? So the notion that that would be something that would be absolved is something that would have an enormous reaction. Second, the perception of cultural invasion, and notably this already exists. You can see this in the opposition to building mosques in much of the developed world, or the importing other cultural products. Third, there is the narrative that this corrupts the state and thus is the state giving funding and legitimacy to these terrible things. Fourth, it jars with cultural values, not only because it obviates it has certain forms of punishment, like payback in Indigenous communities involving literally spearing people through the legs, but also forms of damnable punishment, etc. That has two massive impacts. First, states are less likely to do things like accept Syrian refugees because there's the perception that they will muddy their own society and avail those courts. But second, it leads to much more xenophobia, far more racial attacks, more rioting towards these people who we think are the most vulnerable people in this debate. So on every axis of this debate, we are winning. Very, very proud to oppose.
We thank the member of opposition, and to conclude side government for this debate, we're happy to call upon the government whip. Hear, hear, woo.
Hi, am I audible? All right, I'll just get on my stopwatch. Hi, yeah, can you see me? All right. Cool. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. The reason why CG wins this debate is because we are the only team that gave you very clear principle justification as to why an individual should have the right to choose which justice system governs them to the best possible extent. And I think neither of the opening in their arguments or closing engaged to the principal stance as to why people deserve this right inherent in the very first place. Regardless of all what impacts are, they're speculative, and to a large extent, it's very hard to prove that they're going to happen or not going to happen, which is why the principle is something that you should give the most amount of importance to within this debate. So the first thing I'll do is engage to closing government first, and also within that frame, engage to opening government, and then try and tell you why we differ from OG as to why we win this debate. Okay, so what was closing's argumentation in this debate? Their first claim was that they give you layers of mechanisms in terms of telling you why these courts religions like to become more insular in this sort of situation. Secondly, why they're unlikely to be changing in the very first place. The first thing I want to take up, you want to see over here is that in which world does this court have an incentive, or do these religions have an incentive to become even more insular? I would like you to posit the status quo is one where they have incentive to become even more incident in the very first place. Why? First of all, within status quo, a lot of these religious individuals are not paid attention to in the very first place, which is to say, if you look at places like France, where the burqa is banned, or if you look at places like Belgium, where halal meat is not something that schools require to think of to be important in the very first place to have in a cafeteria, which is why they already feel an oppression against the state in the very first place, which is why I feel that the incentive of these individuals to become even more inwards or even more conservative exists within status quo in the very first place. So what closing opposition does is that they just give you a mech of what status quo is at this point of time without giving you a solution as to how they're going to solve this problem within the future or make this problem even less problematic in the very first place. That's first. The second thing that you need to understand as a result of this, and that Wasif told you, is that the incentive of religion is as such that they're likely and willing to modernize regardless of the situation, which is to say that you cannot have the same principles that you had during the times of Muhammad or you had during the times of Jesus Christ. Why? Because like you said, the old people, they're dying off. Your grand muftis will not exist for the next 50 years. That means you need new followers to come within the religion. You need new people to invest within the religion. You need new people to put their faith on that religion. The reason why this is basically not happening within status quo is because you're becoming more and more conservative, which is why religions to a large extent are changing. You have gay imams, you have a lot of young Islamic music bands that are coming up within status quo, which is why these are concrete examples of religions changing and religion having the incentive of changing, because if they stick to their old scriptures, a lot of people just end up leaving the movement as well. But things like social media, things like presence within social media is making it much more difficult for religions to remain unquestioned in the longer run, which is why we feel that religions inherently have an incentive to change in the long run, but religions also have an incentive to change, make sure that they're changing as well. But the last thing that you need to understand is about the backlash that has happening within society that CEO often points out to you. There are a few things that you should know about this particular part of backlash. The backlash already exists within status quo, which in terms of, I don't see, currently Americans to a large extent don't want to accept Syrian refugees because they already think that they're terrorists or they're going to induce some sort of terror action. This introduction of courts and the damage that is going to happen as a result of this already exists, and a lot of people think that a lot of these things already happen within these enclaves or within these minority communities in the very first place. Why is our world better? Our world is better because this brings in more transparency about the religion and more transparency about how the religion works to the largest possible extent, which is why about things like how your hands don't get cut off the first time you see, but it's rather a more progressive or a more continual punishment as well. Or things like, why does religion think that this particular thing is bad? Or why does religion think that this is something that is unacceptable? Or for example, even if small things like, say for example, taking consuming certain things is bad, religion gives an explanation of why as a result that is bad. So even though those explanations might not be justified or palatable to a large extent, what it basically does, it gives you the origins of this explanation, which is far more persuasive an explanation than say other things like, oh, they're just bad people, or for example, they're just tree huggers or goat fuckers, etc. Mind my tongue. But I think it's far better to gain more visibility about why these things exist as opposed to just assuming that these people are bad inherently. So I think our world gives you more clarity and more visibility. I think that's good. Okay, opening up, I'll take you.
To that, state courts have comparatively more consent, ability to change, and fewer punishments, because lots of victimless religious-based crimes are not punished. This is principally a ball on your side, and you practically screw the vulnerable in religious communities.
I mean, honestly, first of all, the only place that your argument works are in places like Pakistan, where Wasif already told you that a lot of these religious courts are even state courts themselves. Like for example, in places like Pakistan, even places like Bangladesh, a lot of the legal jurisdictions are founded on things like Islamic scholarships and Islamic scholars and Islamic scriptures in the very first place. That's something you have to understand. I don't think the comparative is clear. But in terms of the entire mechanism of coercion to the largest possible extent, and why this is particularly not persuasive, I think first thing that you need to understand, a lot of people are already inherently modernizing within the state as well, which is why you see a lot of people from the Amish community or from Muslim communities break away from the majority community, minority community, and go towards the majority to a large extent. That's first. But secondly, I think to a large extent, things like, if you don't go to this court, I will cut you off from my will. If you don't go to this court, I won't give you money, etc. These things also apply for smaller religious practices as well. Like if you don't pray, you cannot be my son, or if you don't go to Hajj, I won't give you X amount of money. I don't see why the importance of this is only say tied to courts and nothing else whatsoever. I think this is very, very problematic coming in from opening opposition as well, where they feel like the court is the absolute epitome of religious performance, and if you don't go to the courts, you are going to be cut off from anything and everything. I think that's one. But secondly, I think your state is you're born into a state, you're born into religion as well. I think your state is much more difficult to change than your religion, because you need religion, you have much more other options to change. You can go away from a family, but with state, you can't immigrate even if you want to. You can't change your passport even if you want to. We just say religion, if anything, is less coercive if the comparative state in the very first place. So why does closing government then win this debate? We told you that the criteria by which state sets up laws is because we live under the state and the state gives us jurisdiction. We told you to the largest possible extent that the state's jurisdiction at best maybe ends when in this life. Religious jurisdiction extends far beyond that, not only in this life, but not in the second life as well. But the most that the state can do for you is set up education institutions, to minimum healthcare rights and basic rights. What religion does for you is far more micromanaged and far more influential in your life whatsoever. Things like the charities you donate to basically things like which hand you use to eat your food, which is to say, religion inherently has a far greater jurisdiction on human life than anything else, which is why an individual is principally justified in terms of choosing which mechanism they want to punish themselves as well, as opposed to anything else. That's what
we thank the government whip, and to conclude side opposition D, the entire debate as a whole, we're happy to call upon the opposition whip. Here, here. Woo.
Hear me fine? Cool. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, how religions are represented and engaged with. Secondly, what punishments are likely to look like. And then thirdly, some of the other issues in this debate around consistency and transparency, which clashes directly to the material Seamus brings you about how we get less plurality and choice within religions themselves. Note that this gets 0 response from closing government. So firstly, let's look at how religions are represented, because CG's main extension material is this idea that religions are not represented properly under the status quo. They are often minority communities that perhaps are not treated particularly well from the states. A few responses here. The first, as I pointed out in a point of information, that applies to a large number of groups, right? And we don't all necessarily give them these special rights. Why is religion so important? The response that we get from CG is that while we would accommodate them as much as possible, I just think that is a bit impossible. But also at the point in which you're just having a series of different laws that basically supersedes the state, what is the point of having the state at that point? Secondly, though, I would suggest that actually majoritarian conceptions are actually sometimes a good barometer, because if a vast number of people don't think something is a good idea, then maybe it isn't. And if their argument is just like the law should be a little bit better at accommodating cultural difference, obviously it should, but that diminishes our capacity to do that at the point where you just say, fuck off onto your own courts. You give the state no incentive to make reasonable accommodations within mainstream systems, right? So, but insofar as all teams care in this debate about how minority communities are treated both by the state and by wider society, Seamus gives you additional extension material about why this just vastly increases things like racism and xenophobia and the ways that states are likely to treat these individuals, because it again buys into narratives of you're diminishing the separation of church and state, you're eroding cultural values, and those sorts of things. And CG's own kind of only sort of preemptive response to this is just to say, but you assume the worst that is happening in these communities anyway, so there's not much difference. I think rather this just serves as a confirmation bias. All you have to see is literally one example in the media of one bad punishment doled out to suggest that like the state's values are being overridden. That is likely to lead to all the types of harms that Seamus explained and didn't really get engaged with. So at the end of this clash, I would just suggest that their principle is not that important. And insofar as you care about outcomes for these groups, that just gets worse on their side. So let's look at the second question in this debate, which is what sort of punishments are likely to arise from this policy. Because OG's really only claim here is just that you get some sort of social punishment anyway. So maybe your community stigmatizes you when you breach a value, right? And we would agree that that is not ideal, but obviously comparatively, like your community stigmatizing you a little bit is less bad than an enforceable punishment that is decreed by these courts. And rather than just like the back and forth at opening about will it be similar to the state, will it not be a good punishment, I don't know, Seamus gives you explicit material at extension about why structurally you're unlikely to see any reform in the types of punishments that are handed out here. And in fact, they are likely to get worse. He gives you a series of reasons, like the fact that there's now just zero state recourse, the fact that this is a state endorsing these types of punishment, that it buys into social narratives about this being okay, that it's like easier to defend yourself with these types of punishments, and so on, right? And the only response we get from CG is the idea that, oh, well, in general, though, religions have incentives to reform because they want to get more followers and so on. However, that does not engage with this material, because at the point where you've now got a shield from the state and the capacity to do whatever you want and that endorsement, you have less incentive to reform because you've already received that coverage. So I don't think their response is sufficient here. And that obviously leads to the worst outcomes of this debate occurring. That is, types of punishment that are likely to be oppressive to children, oppressive to women, oppressive to people in those communities that cannot advocate for themselves. That is what we uniquely prove at Closing Government. Before I move on, I will take a point of information from Closing Government though.
Okay, so your best mechanism is that these individuals are likely to want to support their core followers, because everything else you suggest are things which are already questioned by OG's setup in this debate. Why is it more likely that you will continue to remain extreme if your own religion is at threat, which is our mechanism?
So, because again, as I just said, you now have a greater capacity to buy narratives of the state has endorsed that. Like, presumably you don't want to reform insofar as I believe that that's important. Now you don't have a series of additional coverage that we explained and you guys don't respond to. So again, I think that is most likely the most in this debate. The final thing I'm going to look at though is some of the remaining in the front half around consistency and transparency. So OG's main thrust here is that this is good because we get better consistent judgments, but they don't actually explain why consistency in any manner is actually good. Seamus actually, though, explains specifically why you're actually likely to get more rigid and less and judgments that have less plurality, for the reason that you will, pick the most pious individuals to serve on these courts, and that kind of just maintains one set of judgments. Before I expand upon that, though, I'm happy to also take a PY from Opening Government.
Sorry, I was muted. Your own opposition explained very well how social punishments are extremely enforceable in tight-knit communities, and now there is no status quo appeal. But this is how you see only the shield element as you see it, but you don't see the delayed and engaging like baton against these communities as well. Please engage with that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't really understand that, so I'm just going to move on to my material, which is that to the extent, presumably both government teams in this debate care about giving people within religions choice, they diminish the capacity for that to happen at all. Because now you're having one decreed judgment that is, perpetuated by these courts. So you don't get any discussion within religions about maybe less extreme forms of punishment, and so on and so on. So if both government teams care about religious people having choice and having their own values represented, obviously that diminishes by a huge amount at the point where you're basically having one court decree this. This gets zero engagement from Closing Government, so still stands. So at the end of this debate, I think we've proven that you actually get worse punishments as a result. The principles that Opening and Closing Government stand behind are fairly unimportant. That's why we're very proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition whip and all of you, all speakers in this debate. Please leave the breakout room and stay in the main Zoom call, and we'll call you back. Panel, take a minute or two to review your notes, and we'll get going.